Hi, I'm Mark from Folk of Gloucester. Due to COVID and the lockdown, unfortunately we can't host Railway Day in the building itself, but we're here online. At 11 o'clock we've got a history of the railways in Gloucester by Tony Conda. Then at 12 o'clock we've got a history of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company by Aaron Matthews. And then the last event from today will be the Tales from the Railway by Ian Hatton. So sit back, enjoy these interesting talks about the railways. Thank you.
I'm Tony Conda and I'm a talking guide for the Civic Trust in Gloucester. This is a talk about Gloucester's railway history done for the Railway Day at the Folk Museum, the Folk, which the Civic Trust now run. So Gloucester's railway history is surprisingly national in outlook because decisions were made in Gloucester that would affect the railways all over the country. Gloucester was quite early on into the railways. Birmingham had a station in 1837. Gloucester had been looking at tramways, and the first railway would arrive in Gloucester in 1840, opening up through to Birmingham in 1841, and that was the Birmingham-Gloucester Railway, standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5, what you see between the tracks when you go to look at them today. Gloucester would become the centre of a railway cross. The next rails would come from Bristol. These were under Isambard Kingdom Brunel, so they are his 7 foot wide gauge, what we call the broad gauge. So in Gloucester, 7 foot rails met 4 foot 8 rails. That was 1844. 1845, after much discussion, the rails from London arrived in Gloucester down the Stroud Valley, again 7 foot wide. And in 1851, through the forest from South Wales, linking eventually the Fishguard ferry with Ireland through to London. The 3 bottom lines are all broad gauge, the top one standard gauge. Of course, from that early crosser railways, Gloucestershire would develop a whole railway network, linking into the valleys around Dursley, linking through the forest with coal and mineral traffic, and more sparsely up into the Cotswolds, and then passenger services developing. But it's Gloucester we're going to look at mostly today. It's difficult when you look at Gloucester now to think just how much there was in terms of railway infrastructure. This is the view into the city over the top of the Great Western Railway sheds, roughly from the hospital site in Gloucester today, looking into the heart of the city. Eastgate Station on the left, the Great Western Station on the right. But it all started much more simply with the tramway arriving from Cheltenham and opening up in about 1811, crossing Horton Road here and making its way past the park and down to the docks. Cheltenham desperately needed more coal. The town was growing fast and they needed the coal supplies that could be brought in by the River Severn to Gloucester. So the tramway made its way across country, and not so long ago you could still climb the gasometer on Horton Road near the hospital and look down at Horton Road, and this is the old line of the tramway coming across Horton Road and then going away into Gloucester, and it wound its way through, and you can still find traces of it. Behind Brunswick Square you've got very handily named Old Tramway Road, and you can follow that route through into the docks themselves. And up till 1860 or so you'd still have had traces down by the side of the river where the lock into the dock was. Well, the lock's still there, but the tramway's gone, coming down Commercial Road and down to the old quayside at Gloucester. The tramway disappeared in the 1860s because the railway had come and most of what it was used for, its use disappeared. The tramways had been looked at throughout the 1820s and 1830s. There was one glorious suggestion that a tramway from the River Avon at Bristol would come all the way up through Gloucester and head for Birmingham. You can imagine the poor old horse faced with that journey. It's not so good. In the 1830s, they began to look at plans for steam railways to link Gloucester through to Birmingham. And the first person on the scene was Isambard King of Brunel. A lazy day at the office, went to sleep after lunch and drew a line like that across the paper up through Evesham. But that was the easiest route to get from Gloucester to Birmingham. It was the least uphill route. Still had to get to the top. That was rejected, and essentially the people looking to pay for a line between Birmingham and Gloucester said, find us the cheapest land, build us a route that costs as little as possible. Other people said, well heavens, we've got all these towns and cities down through the Severn corridor, let's build lines that link up Worcester and Kidderminster and various other places and bring that down. No, the company of proprietors up in Birmingham said, no, we want to go directly to Gloucester. The idea is we're going to reach the docks. The docks have opened in 1827. We want to bring freight traffic down into Gloucester. So that dark black line through the map is the line that was produced. And it gets complicated between Cheltenham and Gloucester, it always does. At Cheltenham, there were a couple of other lines proposed, one of them being the line that looks like barbed wire through here, Cheltenham and Great Western Union line through to London. Again engineered by Brunel, who'd persuaded the proprietors that the best way to do that was to go south from Gloucester and up through the Stroud valleys, because that's the only way he could see steam engines getting up to the top of the Cotswolds. What Parliament said, faced with two Acts of Parliament, one a line from Birmingham to Gloucester and the other the line from Cheltenham to London, was where they overlapped at the bottom, whoever got their Act of Parliament first was the one that would be built. And it was the Cheltenham and Great Western Union that got their act through first. Now they weren't interested in Gloucester docks and freight, so the whole purpose of the first line was put to one side by the Parliamentary Act, who said, no, you've got to agree on the route between Cheltenham and Gloucester and it'll be that line. So they pushed the original idea for the line to Gloucester and attached it to the Cheltenham line, moved it as far into the centre of Cheltenham as they could afford to build a railway station, and then came through to a station in Gloucester and then on south, which produced all the complications which we still have in Gloucester today of trains from the north going south. If they're coming to Gloucester, they have to come in and go back out again. So a simple Act of Parliament caused a real complication in Gloucester. The line north of Cheltenham went through the cheapest land, and then they found themselves having to climb the Lickey Incline. The Lickey Incline is 1 in 37 in old money, which is as steep as a railway gets on the main line. And yes, it might have been cheap to buy, but it gave them a real headache in terms of what motive power they could actually use to get up it. At the time, most railway locomotives were simple four-wheel things, quite capable of handling a decent tonnage of passengers, but faced with that climb up the hill, the company said to the railway manufacturers, what can you produce that will definitely get up that hill? And with the demands on their capacity at the time, they weren't particularly bothered about talking to a little company from Gloucester to Birmingham. And it was by chance, apparently, that the representative of a Philadelphia engine builder came into the company offices and said, oh gee, yes, we can build those, we've got hills like that in America, we're going up and down them all the time. And on the back of a fag packet drew them a plan for the railway locomotive. they hadn't actually built it in America at the time it was sold to us in Gloucester, but there we are. And it's one of the first cases where Britain actually went and bought stuff from America and had it brought back across the Atlantic rather than stuff going in the opposite direction. They did build the locomotive. The English engineers said, well, they're cheating really. They've put all the weight on one big wheel at the back so you get great grip to drive it up the hill. And by the way, they tighten up the safety valve so they can get even greater pressure in the boiler. But it might blow up. Anyway, it worked. And the trains began to steam up the Lickey Incline in the 1840s, linking Gloucester through to Birmingham. So the line opens into Gloucester, crosses Horton Road, roughly where the tramway crossed, and the station in Gloucester, the first station, was built roughly in the car park of the existing railway station, opposite the land registry. It was a very simple station, not the great porticoed things that you see at the London and the Birmingham stations. This is it taken in much later in life, when it's certainly even more humble. But behind that were the train sheds that the standard gauge locos and carriages came into. Because the Birmingham to Gloucester Company had thought that they'd be linking up to the docks, they had actually also started down on the canal side, and they'd built a huge dock for themselves, and beside it they'd built plants for making coke out of coal. The coal would come in from South Wales and they would turn that into coke, because the early railway locomotives worked off coke as a fuel. But because they lost out in Parliament, the freight lines down to it never got built. And they used to have wonderful shareholders meetings where people would say, right, well, you appear to be wasting loads of money down in here. You've built a dock, it's filling up with mud. What's happening to it? You've wasted £20,000 of the shareholders' money building this dock. Whereupon the company's only reaction was to say, point of order, it's not £20,000, it's £14,000, which was a heck of a lot of money in those days. And it would take quite a long time to unscramble the problem that Parliament had caused. Finally, in 1844, the line from Bristol arrived, crossed over the standard gauge right on the road crossing at Horton Road, and the two lines came together in the railway station. Great opening day. Huge long train steamed up from Bristol with the Lord Mayor of Bristol on it to have lunch with the Mayor of Gloucester and everything. As it went round the curve there, it fell off the tracks. The track wasn't up to it. And all the dignitaries from Bristol had to get off their carriages, walk round the rest of it and sit down to have lunch, while Isambard King de Brunel, who was on the train, that took off his hat and had to help get everything back on the track so that the return journey to Bristol could be made. The obvious problem was that here you've got trains travelling on a 7-foot wide track, and here you've got trains travelling on a 4'8" track. So everybody had to change trains. And this was something that began to upset people. And they began to talk about it. But before that was resolved, the actual companies had a lot to think about. The line from Bristol to Birmingham became one company. The two separate companies, north and south of Gloucester, joined up, became one company, even though they'd got different sized tracks, and they decided that they would sell themselves either to the Great Western Railway or the Midland Railway. Great Western they favoured. And this is, again, Gloucester, part of Gloucester's history within the railways. Had they been successful in selling themselves to the Great Western would probably have made a broad gauge track north of Gloucester up to Birmingham, and the whole history of the 7-foot wide railway could have been different. But as we'll see, they didn't. So Edmund Sturge, one of three brothers, great family doing business in the docks in Birmingham, corn factors and all sorts of other things, were members, the Sturge brothers were members of the railway company. And they were trying to sell themselves to the Great Western. Charles Saunders was the secretary. The Great Western had rather overextended themselves. They didn't have an awful lot of money. And so they told the Gloucester people, basically, this is our deal, take it or leave it. Gloucester people didn't like it. So they went back, had another think about it, and they were travelling up to London, Sturge and a fellow director. They got on a train at Rugby to get to London because that's where they'd been at the time, and discussing how they were going to approach the Great Western Railway people. In the carriage, suddenly a man in the corner of the carriage spoke up and he said, well, if you don't get satisfaction, gentlemen, from the Great Western Railway, I will buy your line. And who are you, sir? Well, we are the Midland Railway. And it seems coincidentally that this man was sitting in the carriage. That's how the story goes anyway. And that would be John Ellis, who was director of the Midland. And when they were unsuccessful in the negotiations with Charles Saunders, the line from Bristol up to Birmingham was sold to the Midland. And that would make it eventually become Fulford 8.5 and bring it into the standardised railway system. When you think of several people in a railway carriage and the sort of voice from the corner, actually Sturge and the Midland Railway were quite well connected. This is a picture from 1840 of one of the great anti-slavery meetings in London. And here is Ellis, and here are the Sturge brothers. They were all in the anti-slavery movement. They must have known one and they must have talked. So perhaps that was a put-up story to save the Great Western's face. So now we have the Great Western, we have the two lines, one from Bristol, one from Birmingham, meeting at Gloucester railway station. And this view of Queen Victoria changing trains at Gloucester gives you an idea of what the railway station actually looked like. There wouldn't have been a grandstand of people watching every time. That was put on specially. She's changing trains onto the broad gauge, and she's come down the west coast of the country because there's a cholera outbreak in London at the time, and she's travelling from Scotland to the Isle of Wight, and she doesn't want to catch cholera, so she's come through Gloucester. But it shows you she and everybody else had to change from one gauge, the standard gauge, to the broad gauge at Gloucester. And it became the butt of jokes in Punch. You can imagine the problems of travelling in Victorian times with actually changing trains. The wonderful dresses that people wore, how they crammed those into the railway carriages, I've no idea. The number of people travelling, and of course you also had the time factor, and the Great Western gradually took on London time and it became railway time. So you get a clock at Bristol with 3 hands because there's 9 minutes difference between what time the train will leave and what time you're actually working on. So Bristol is 9 minutes after London. It's bad enough reading a railway timetable at the best of times, let alone with the added problem of trying to work out what the time difference is. Add that onto the fact that you've got everybody getting off one train wanting to get on another one if they're not actually getting off in Gloucester. And the Illustrated London News drew this amazing picture of what people travelled with and how they travelled from one train to the other. And it caused chaos. and began to get people actually noticing what was going on in Gloucester. Punch developed a phrase, "lost at Gloucester." If you've lost something, you'd say, "Oh, I must have lost it at Gloucester," changing from one train to the other. This is the proud husband. "Have you got all the small parcels?" my wife said to me. "Yes," I said, 23 in all. Then she said to me, "Give me the baby." I said to her, "What? Haven't you got him?" "We lost the baby at Gloucester." Shocking. And people began to talk about it in London, and people began to say, how can we let people build a railway system around the country that's 4'8" in one place and 7 foot in another, and what happens when they all join up, and shouldn't we actually do something about it? Parliament at the time was quite happy to sit back, make sure that railway companies were pretty well financially successful, but they hadn't really thought about the mechanics of a system developing right across the country. And they finally decided that they would send a delegation down to Gloucester in 1845, led by the Astronomer Royal. I suppose he was the only engineer they could find who wasn't involved in railways at the time. And they came down to look at what happened in Gloucester when people changed from one train to another. Mr. Payne, who was the freight superintendent, organised 3 trains to be unpacked and scattered across the goods yard, just to make it look even more chaotic than it actually was, because the Midland were determined that Parliament would come down and say the 4'8.5" gauge is the one that the country must have, and get rid of the 7 foot Isambard Kingdom Brunel gauge. It was pretty much a given anyway, given that there were about 2,000 miles of 4'8" gauge and only about 200 miles of the 7 foot wide gauge. Parliament decided, and they decided they would standardise on the 4'8" gauge in the United Kingdom, and they would standardise on the 5'3" gauge within Ireland, which isn't quite standardisation within the British Isles, but Parliament knows best, no doubt. It wasn't just passengers, it wasn't just freight. There were horses and things like that travelling, which also had to be shifted from one train to another. It must have been a chaotic day's work at Gloucester when you had the 2 gauges operating side by side. I always like to think of your Victorian, say, an articled clerk coming down to look at the estate management of somewhere, arrives at Gloucester and looks for a coach or a carriage to take him out to Maysmore or whatever, and is then, here's your conveyance, sir, and they bring him a really spirited horse. We're so lucky today, there's always a taxi rank outside the station. After much argument, in 1847, they finally decided that a freight branch could be built into the docks, and it followed the line of the tramway into the docks. The standard gauge Midland entered the docks in 1847. The Great Western would enter a bit later. The line from London had now opened, in broad gauge terms, right through into the heart of Cheltenham. And for a very short while, the express trains forgot Gloucester, steamed straight through and went to Cheltenham, stopping at what they called the Tea Station. And there, which is the Morrison site in the Railway Triangle now, the Gloucester carriages would be detached from the wonderful broad gauge express, turned on a small turntable, and they would be pulled into Gloucester Station behind a horse. And you imagine you've steamed all the way out of London over Maidenhead Bridge, down the Stroud Valleys and everything, then you arrive in Gloucester behind a horse. Magnificent. And that was the Tea Station. It lasted until the 1950s, just a little transfer station, and then it was taken down on the site by the main line. It was sad, but that it lasted for 4 years. It went in 1851 when the new line opened from the Forest. So for a while you had broad gauge, standard gauge, all operating in the same area. Gradually the Midland extended its 4'8.5" lines, and the broad gauge would eventually disappear. But the next line in came from the Forest, and they decided they would build a new Great Western Railway station separate from the Midland. So now Gloucester had a through line. The important one from London would run straight through, whereas the north-south line would run into the Midland station, and if you wanted to carry on to Bristol, the train would come back out again and then go south round a new loop railway through Tuffley and down to the south, into Gloucester, back out again backwards and then down, which is pretty well what happens today. So we don't progress that fast, do we? And you can sort of look at that bit of history by the buildings which are still there today. The station hotel opposite the bus station is there, and it's on the maps here with the railway running through. So that's the old Midland station, pretty well opposite where the station hotel is today. The second station, the new Brunel Great Western Station with the lines coming in from South Wales, was a massive affair. Brunel liked to have all these trains on one long platform. It was one of the longest platforms in the country. The little Midland station is just hiding out the back here in the back of the Great Western Station. So that lasted for a while and then it was cut back. But of course today, with the changes to the stations, you again got that huge long sweeping platform, and it must look today a bit like it did in Brunel's time. That end of the platform was added after the Midland Railway had gone from Gloucester. So 3 of our lines were broad gauge, 7 foot wide. Turner celebrated that in his famous painting of the Great Western Railway coming out of London. In Gloucester, Barrett's, the photographers in George Street, managed to do a deal with the railway company whereby trains could be backed down outside the back window of Barrett's shop in George Street, so the photographer could take pictures out of his bathroom window of the broad gauge expresses, and there's a whole range of these wonderful pictures. London Road in the background. These were the trains that worked through Gloucester in the 1850s through to the 1870s. The whole idea of travel worried people. Punch has a running commentary on railway journeys. This is a lady discovering that maybe she should have insured her life. She had never thought she was going to be doing anything dangerous when she went on a train. And then somebody rings a bell in her ear. The bell was the signifier that the train will be leaving within the next 5 minutes. Punch again. The young man is telling the old man the horrors of railway travel. Why, just the other day the boiler blew up on an express train and people died. The actual detail of the carriages is wonderful. You see their top hats hanging up on special cords from the top of the railway carriage. Punch and others followed the birth of railways, and especially the accidents that actually introduced safety to the railways, with awful rhymes. And Gloucester people were actually involved in one of the early accidents in Sunning Cutting near Reading on Christmas Eve, I think it was, people coming back from London, workmen who'd been working on the new Houses of Parliament, rebuilding it after a fire there, coming back to Gloucestershire, travelling third class, leaving London at about 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark, hit a landslip in Sunning-Cutting, and the freight bit of the train that was behind them concertinaed into the carriages they were in, and 13 people died. The Great Western Railway shortly afterwards said that they had a wonderful safety record and they'd never killed anybody in first or second class. Third class wasn't mentioned. The broad gauge lasted for a long time. It lasted through to 1872, 1873 in Gloucestershire. It was replaced, and the last bits were done over a weekend, so that the whole of the railway in Gloucestershire became standard gauge. The last broad gauge trains actually left London in the 1890s down to the southwest peninsula. So broad gauge didn't die overnight when Parliament changed the rules. They let it linger on where it didn't meet other lines. In Gloucestershire, that was pushed forward and it all changed. So let's look at the other station, the Midland Railway Station, Eastgate Station. So the original Midland Station was the one near the Railway Hotel, near the bus station. Gradually the Midland changed its focus onto the curve south through Tuffley, and in the 1890s they finally built themselves a brand new railway station which came really off the end of, as it were, Eastgate Street, coming down from the centre of the city. The two, the Great Western and the Midland, were joined by a long walkway across all the tracks, so you could actually get from one station to the other by foot. It was again a fairly humble station, Eastgate, fairly low, and it was the most sensible station in many ways in Gloucester from a north-south point of view, because the trains from Birmingham to Bristol could come straight in and then go straight on south again without all this backwards and forwards that had been happening before. And Eastgate, here's Gloucester Park, and the main line curving south, and of course there was the branch round the park and down to the docks. In the background you've got the Great Western running through. That was the walkway between the two stations. You can imagine people being tugged by their earlobes from one station to the other, trying to catch the train to Western for a day out at the beach. The Midland Railway dominated on that route. Smaller express trains, and then in British Rail days you'd get the south-west traffic coming down through Eastgate, freight traffic coming to the docks. And for a while Eastgate Station actually became the main line from Gloucester to London, because again you could come from Cheltenham straight through Eastgate Station, down to the south, up through the Stroud Valleys and off to London, no backwards and forwards. But the decision was taken in 1975 to shut it down, largely because of the road crossings in Gloucester through Tuffley. There were several roads with crossings on them, and that was holding traffic up, they decided. So the lines were removed, Eastgate Station disappeared, and the Asda in Gloucester is built pretty well on that site. If you stood on the platform at Eastgate, looking south to Barton Gates and the church there at the end of Barton Street, and if you look there today, that would be pretty well the same view. The end of the church, the signal box used to hang out over and the lines went straight on through down in that direction. Everybody remembers Barton Gates, everybody of a certain age anyway, being held up while trains shunted backwards and forwards, or long expresses drew out of the station and went down south off towards Tuffley. The long argued about docks branch curved round through the park and came down to the canal side near Foster's Oil Mills and down where the shopping centres now are. If you'd crossed over Bristol Road, you'd have been going over the traffic gates here and looking into that yard, Fielding and Platt there, and the wagon works on the other side, and a wonderful wet day with all that horrible smoke and smuts filling the atmosphere. These days it's shops. So this was where the company had built that dock for coking back in the old days. All that got filled in and the marshalling yards filled the space. The wagon works, huge Gloucester engineering business producing carriages and wagons for all over the country, all over the world in the long run, Fielding and Platt, and the branch through into the docks themselves. And virtually every building in the docks was linked to the railways. The lines ran between the warehouses, across the lock, across Lantony Bridge. On this side the broad gauge came in, and there were a few mixed gauge rails which you could run either on. To the north end of the docks, the Midland Railway here being shunted in with horses rather than locomotives, because the locomotives were too heavy to go over some of the weaker bits of the system. So they'd bring the wagons right through into the docks. At the other end you've got the broad gauge wagons coming through from the line that crossed Olney Island. And Lantony Bridge must have been an amazing sight if you were going along Lantony Road to find one of these things coming in the opposite direction. The swing bridge was modified to take the railway, rebuilt to take the railway, and that linked the Midland and the, by now, after 1873, standard gauge Great Western. And the industrial lines of Gloucester spread out either side of the canal, linking through the carriage and wagon works and down into the timber yards. On the other side you eventually get the power station with its lines coming in, and you've got the lines that go down towards Hempstead. At Hempstead itself there was a Midland line which came past the old gasworks there and through the timber yards and crossed the canal on a swivelling bridge which had its own little signal box. That wasn't much used, and it went out of use in the 1930s. That line would curve round and come back on the western side of the docks, round the back of timber ponds where they used to keep the timber wet. And this is a First World War view with all the wagons all going off to France, built in Gloucester, waiting for trains to take them. And that's the lines running round the back of the docks. Coming in from the forest side, you've got the old route of the A40 climbing up to go out over Telford's Over Bridge. The main line of the railway comes in and runs through to Gloucester Station. This branch crossed Olney Island and went into big marshalling yards where goods for the canal were sorted out, and later a lot of coal came through into for Gloucester's power station down on Castle Meads. Being Olney Island, from time to time it all went underwater. This is the 1947 floods, and this is the fireless locomotive which served the gasworks down there, ran off the steam pressure created and put into the boiler. It didn't have a fire itself, as in a normal steam engine. That's preserved and it's waiting now, I think, to go on display down at the Vale of Berkeley Railway. So coming in from Wales, again in 1947, crossing the line of the river. This is the Black Bridge. The pumps here used to lift water out of the river and pump it up to the engine sheds at Gloucester for the boiler water for the engines. That is still there. The old boating lake used to be down here. But in 1947, of course, it's all gone underwater, as has quite a deal of Gloucester. So the line came across Archdeacon Meadows and through into the station as we know it today. Eastgate is down at the bottom. And that's pretty well been the centre of Great Western Railway operations in Gloucester for all time. The old station had, as a very significant feature, that signal box high up above the tracks looking either way, because Gloucester was a great place for trains coming in from Hereford and from the valleys. It was a great mixing point. It was a great place for train spotters to come. Lots of people used to come to Gloucester because it was a stronghold of steam. Here it's decked over all, I think, for probably the coronation back in the early 1950s. It was replaced by the architectural marvel that is Gloucester Railway Station today. And of course, a lot of the action we've been talking about with the early Midland Railway was happening here in the car park. That's the Horton Road crossing, where you've got the Bristol line coming up and crossing over, the Birmingham line coming and crossing over, all on the railway crossing. And of course, once upon a time, you'd also have had horse-drawn tramway wagons wending their way right across the middle of that picture. The crossing's still there. It's still a nuisance to people in Gloucester, but it's much smaller these days. The signal box used to stand there, and behind it was the line of the tramway curving off to Cheltenham. These days, everything's been simplified. The signal box is gone. Horton Road is still there, and you still have to wait for ages as trains cross backwards and forwards. Looking again out from the top of the gasometer on Horton Road, looking to the railway triangle, these were the old Midland Railway sheds where their locomotives were looked after and serviced. The Great Western ones were serviced behind, again from Horton Road. Gradually, the railway shrank, Eastgate disappeared, and the railway triangle for years just sat and mouldered. And various people had plans. They said, well, all this business of Gloucester, we started off back in the 1840s with trains from Birmingham coming into Gloucester and then having to go out backwards before they went on south. And here we are in the 1960s and 70s, and all the trains that want to go to Bristol from Birmingham that are going to call at Gloucester have to come into Gloucester and go out backwards again. We don't seem to have got very far. Why can't we put a new railway station on the triangle on the north-south line so that Gloucester can have a new railway station? But of course, that was never looked at. It's been brought back several times, but now, of course, we've got much better. We've got a new supermarket instead, which is much nicer. The only trouble with the Morrisons there is that they didn't build the cafe, so you can actually sit in it and look at the railway trains, but never mind. Gloucester Railway Station is still there, still serving the various lines. It's been modernised, it's got improved lifts and things like that, so everybody can get from one platform to another, and it still offers a decent service. It's pure accident that it arrived there because of a decision in the Houses of Parliament back in the 1830s as the bills were first looked at. What had been proposed for Gloucester way back by Captain Morsam, who was the engineer for the Birmingham line, was that Gloucester would get a freight line into the docks and a passenger line that would cut through the middle of town and serve a new station. If you'd have stood in Southgate Street and had that line been built, you'd have had a totally different view. On arches through it would have come the line from Birmingham, and that would have travelled through to Gloucester, Blackfriars railway station. Who knows what damage that would have done architecturally. And it would have ended there, high up, as Phil Moss has drawn it, outside Blackfriars. Here's Isambard Kingdom Brunel looking cross down in the corner because he hasn't had the chance to build his line. And Gloucester Blackfriars, well, how long would it have lasted as a very small railway station high up on an elevated section? But it shows, I think, just how much the draw of the docks was back in those early days of the railways, when people were thinking, how do we start to link places together? I hope that has given you some ideas. You can certainly walk around and see a lot of where this railway infrastructure was. There are little bits of rails all over the docks if you care to look for them. Gloucester has a long railway history and part of the national history. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed that talk by Tony. I certainly did. It's fantastic. Now our next talk is going to be at 12 o'clock and it's about the Gloucester Railway and Carriage Works. The next one's going to be live. That Tony one was pre-recorded. We did it just before lockdown, so we just managed to get in there, but we couldn't do the other two, so they're going to be live and they're going to be on Zoom. So just bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. I'm going to go off and sort it all out now. Fingers crossed, we'll be on the dot at 12 o'clock. And if we're a little bit late, then please bear with us. Thank you very much. See you all in a bit.
trustee of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Museum. We've been asked by the friends at the Civic Trust to hold a presentation today on the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company and ourselves. First of all, if anything goes wrong, please do let us all know. I am aware some of the photographs we will be showing and the artifacts we will be showing might be the wrong way round. Unfortunately, we can't do anything about that. So let's start. So early in January 1860, a group of sort of railway and local businessmen come together to form the Gloucester Wagon Company, as it was. These included Richard Potter of Fife and Company, Edmund Walton of Walton and Sons, W.C. Lucy of W.C. Lucy and Company, and one that I know very well, and some of you may know, Mr. William Nix of Nix and Baxter, now known as Nix Timber. I'm just trying to get a photograph up to show you. Here's Mr. William Nix of Nix Timber. Hope you can all see that. So this is one of the founders of the wagon company. I also used to work for the company itself a few years ago. So that's Mr. William Nix of Nix and Baxter, now known as Nix Timber. Next, we have two outsiders of the company. One being Richard II Smith, who was goods agent for the Great Western Railway, and also Mr. John Nuthall Brown. I've got another photograph to show just now of Mr. Brown. He was, as I said, general manager of the South Staffordshire Railway, who came on board for their specialist knowledge in railways. The founders thought Gloucester would be a good place for such a business. And the reason for that was they could supply goods wagons to South Wales, Staffordshire, and other mineral districts of the UK. On January 30th, 1860, a meeting was held in Gloucestershire to form the Gloucester Wagon Company, the predecessor to the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited, with a share capital of then £100,000 in 10,000 shares of £10 each. That is approximately 5.9 million today. The first general manager, which I don't have a photograph of, sadly, was Mr. Isaac Slater. A great day came on the 10th of April, 1860. The first stone of the workshops was laid, with underneath it a selection of coins, these being or including a florin, a sixpence, fourpence, threepence, and a parchment of paper inscribed with the directors of the company and the current first general manager. Now, I think if all goes well, my father is on the other end of the discussion, who has two coins from pre-1860s he would like to show us. Over to you.
Paul.
Now, if I can come back in again. Next, in February 1861, the works employed a total of 360 hands, and by the end of 1860, they had already turned out 313 wagons. In 1867, the first international order was received for the Ural and Vybisk Railway in Russia. Special grease had to be supplied for these wagons in particular, and rolling stock, as the local peasants at the time would eat the grease that was readily available over there. Now we skip ahead to the 1870s. The chairman, Richard II. Smith, had a number of interviews with Mr. Pullman. And those of you who are aware or aren't aware, Mr. Pullman was the creator and founder of the Pullman Car Company in America, who created the elaborate Pullman cars. And I do know when the Folk Museum was around, we had a meeting with Sarah Orton, and she allowed us to hold an exhibition there a couple of years ago. And in their collection at the time, they did have a book, I think it was, from the Pullman Car Company, which was signed by Mr. Pullman himself and issued to the chairman, Richard II. Smith, who I just mentioned a while ago. Also, during the 1880s, the company also felt a pinch during the time. And sadly, they had many ups and downs, just like the museum has over the first couple of years. And therefore, the directors chose to have a cut of funds, and themselves, they chose to cut themselves down to a total of £500 per year, which in today's money is around about £33,000 a year. My father now has a small collection of paperwork from the 1880s, roughly about 1886, of solicitors' letters and property letters, which sort of talk about the various issues and that sort of thing. They were written by the general manager, which was Mr. Isaac Slater at the period. Next, we skip on ahead a little bit more, just 1 year to 1887. Now, the wagon works was, as I mentioned earlier, called the Gloucester Wagon Company from 1860 until 1887, when a name change came to what we know now as the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited. And now we skip ahead a bit further to 1894. Now, many of you may be aware that sort of between 1868 and 1894, during the creation of the Severn and Wye Railway, which is probably better known now as the Dean Forest Railway, Mr. William Easy constructed a number of buildings for the railway, for the Dean, what is now known as the Dean Forest Railway, formerly the Severn and Wye. And Mr. William Easy, who was a wooden buildings manufacturer based in Gloucester, next door to the Gloucester Wagon Company, was taken over after circa 1894, by the wagon works themselves, who continued the manufacture of wooden framed buildings. And now, if I'm right, if my father's got them to hand, we have two artifacts from the Severn and Wye Railway. These are a signalling rod, cable guide, and a track rail clip, both from the Severn Bridge station on the Lydney side. And now we go further ahead to 1896. Now, rather interestingly, we do have a poster, which hopefully my dad can show you shortly, but not quite yet, of the Brighton and Rottingdean Seashore Electric Railway. Now, this collection of vehicles were nicknamed Daddy Longlegs, and they were designed by Magnus Volks of the Volks Electric Railway, based in Brighton. These vehicles were rather unique, as they stood about 20 or so, well, about 100 and so foot in the air on four legs. And to drive them, you had to be a qualified sea captain, as it was driven through water during the 1890s. Over to you, Dad, if you can show the picture, the poster. Now, I do also have, obviously that was a poster with a painting on. I do have one or two photographs of the car themselves also, which are, if I just show you this one here first. Here we go. This is a photograph taken in the 1890s of the vehicle itself. Sadly, the cars were destroyed. They were destroyed during the early 1900s. And sadly, there's no remains of the cars left at all. There is a model of the car, or one of the cars, in the museum in Brighton, and you can still see the original stones that was laid for the railway to travel on. Next, we jump forward again to 2 years later in 1898 with the creation of the London electric taxis built by the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. Now, these vehicles, to our knowledge, were the very first electric taxis to be issued to London. Sadly, I don't have a good enough photograph to hand at the moment. But I would be, we would be happy if you email us. We can show these photographs and things that I've mentioned in this presentation today. Now, we jump forward again to 1899, so another year later. And between 1899 and 1902, for those who are aware, there was the Boer War, which was fought in areas like South Africa. And the museum, or the company, originally built ambulances for this period in history. They built horse-drawn ambulances for use during the Boer War. Now, again, jumping ahead again to 1910 this time, my father will shortly show you, hopefully, if all goes well, a long service medal that was issued to a Mr. Charles Meadows. Unfortunately, we do not have a certificate, but we are aware that certificates and medals were issued together during this period. This certificate is for 50 years service from 1860 to 1910.
Yep.
We've chosen not to clean this medal because it has a lovely patina and it's part of the history of the item itself. Now we go to 1911, where a new chairman came on board, and this time it was Richard Vassar Smith. I do have a photograph of the gentleman. For those who are aware, Richard Vassar Smith, hopefully here we go. Well, I say the photograph, it's more of a piece of artwork. Richard Vassar Smith was chairman of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, but he was also chairman of Lloyds Bank. Now, it's interesting to know that the museum's bank account is also with Lloyds, and we didn't sort of know about Richard Vassar Smith until after we joined Lloyd's. Now we skip ahead only sort of 3 years, sorry, to the First World War. Now, as many of you are aware, the First World War was not very pleasant, and we do have a small collection of artifacts and relics and items from this period. If I show you the first one, this is nothing directly relating to the First World War. I must apologise again if everything's back to front, but this artifact here, if you can see, is a prize certificate issued to a Mr. Cornwall, and it's been scribbled on by the company themselves, and it states Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited, Employees Horticultural and Industrial Association, Saturday, July 24th, 1915. Section has been scribbled out, and they've put drawing competition in place. Special prize, box of drawing implements or instruments awarded to S. Cornwall. So that's a lovely piece of artifact from the 1914-18 war. Now, I do have a couple of photographs I will show you, but first I'd like to show you this little model. The original, or one of the originals, does survive. It's in preservation on a heritage railway in the UK, and this is a lovely little model of a Gloucester-built ambulance wagon. This was built during the First World War for use over in France and areas that saw frontline fighting, and it was used to carry injured soldiers and troops from the front line to the nearest hospital. It's narrow gauge, and the original, as I said, is one of these is preserved. It's only recently come back into traffic. And inside, I'm not sure if you can see, but inside there's stretchers and other items inside. They're quite a highly detailed model, but if you don't want to, if you'd like to go and see the original, I can find the exact location for you. And now, if I can hand over to my father, Paul, who has a wagon plate for a general service wagon. I have a photograph, but I'll show you the photograph after my dad's shown you the plate itself. He also has a World War I medal he'd like to show, but obviously during the First World War, the wagon works manufactured ambulances, both horse-drawn and railway related, stretchers, and many other artifacts and items that sadly no longer exist. But as I say, we have a small collection of artifacts that we'd like to show you.
Here you go.
Now, the last artifact my father showed, I did forget to mention, and that was a World War, well, post-World War, sorry, pre-World War One and World War One, for St. John's Ambulance watch chain, which dates from around pre-1916. I think it's 1909 to 1916. And now, regarding that plate my father held up, which said Wagon S, if I can just show you this photograph of an example. It was not a Gloucester-built example, sadly, as far as I'm aware, but it's an example all the same. Now, this is a horse-drawn general service wagon, which dates from around 1915 itself. As I said, from my research, this isn't a Gloucester-built example, but it's one that matches a Gloucester-built general service wagon. Now, again, we sort of during the war, a company was formed called Wagon Repairs Limited. Now, Wagon Repairs Limited was formed or registered on the 5th of March 1918, and it was owned by 5 companies, various companies in the UK, these being Charles Roberts, the Midland Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, the Metropolitan Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, Motherwell's Hurst Nelson Company, and the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. Their specific aims were to carry out in the UK and elsewhere to trade or business of repairing, rebuilding, reconstruction, repainting, altering, converting, equipping, adapting, making fit for traffic, supplying and detailing with railway and other wagons, trucks, coaches, carriages, trolleys, vans, vehicles, and other repairing of wheels, axles, and components. Basically, it was to sort of look after, maintain, and repair and restore wagons owned by the companies that were mentioned and those of other companies. And if I'm right, my father should have to hand an example of one of the plates from this period in history.
Here you go.
Now we skip forward to 2 years, well, between 2 and a few years later, to the 1920s and 30s. Now, many of you may know Mr. Stanley Baldwin, who was Prime Minister during the 30s. Well, I'll bring up a photograph of Mr. Stanley Baldwin. And Mr. Stanley Baldwin, before he became Prime Minister, he was on the board of directors for the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. And there, hopefully you can see the photograph now of Mr. Stanley Baldwin, but he was, before he became Prime Minister in the 1930s, he was a director on the board of directors at the Wagon Works. Now, another interesting fact is from we skip forward to 1931 now. And if I'm right, hopefully I have a photograph, another one to show you. This time it's of Sir Leslie Boyce, first Baronet. Hopefully the photograph will come up now in his regalia. But as I said, Sir Leslie Boyce, during this time he wasn't a Sir, but Mr. Leslie Boyce at the time in 1931 became chairman of the Wagon Works itself. And now we skip forward a few years to the Second World War. Now, this period is one of my favourites. I run a number of other projects relating to the Second World War, sort of thing. So if I do ramble a bit, please do let me know. But my father will show you a few artifacts, and I will as well, hopefully in due course, including a model of a Gloucester-built war wagon that was used to transport Allied Sherman tanks during the Second World War. A 1939 rolling stock catalogue, which I've got to hand here. My father doesn't have to show this because I'll show it now. It's a lovely, quite old rolling stock catalogue from the Second World War. It features a lot of information, many of which and art and adverts from the period. One of which I will mention now, as it was built sort of during the period, if I can find it, and I'll show you a photograph of it. And it's in this book. It's coined the Indian Prince's Travel Palace, which, to those who are in the know, sort of thing, it's known as Maharaja of Indoor's State Saloon, and it still survives today over in India. It's still owned, as far as we are aware, by the royal family. So there's a lovely artifact from the Second World War, or just before the Second World War started. We also have, which we recently acquired, a lovely little leather-bound diary cover, diary cover sort of thing. And if you can see inscripted here, it says, "With the compliments of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Co. Limited, Gloucester," in gold leaf. And to accompany this, we acquired a lovely little wartime diary issued by the company. Here's the diary itself, dated 1942. Now, in this little diary, the front covers, as you can see here, the one side mentions the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, and on this side here, the other side, it says, "Owing to wartime restrictions, we have had to curtail the information in this diary. All information given is correct at the time of going to press, but it is subject to variation after that date. The summertime given is that prescribed by the Summertime Act 1925. It is liable to alteration by order in council," which I think is a lovely example, and that accompanies the leather-bound wallet cover, or leather-bound diary cover, shall I say. If I show you this before my father does, because I can talk all day about these, Churchill tanks. Now, the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, during the Second World War, constructed 764 Churchills. From obviously, these are from various different given dates, ranging. The first orders were received in 1940, but they arrived during 1941. Sadly, I don't have a photograph, but I did have a photograph ready, but it's not on there. There is one Gloucester-built example surviving in the world. This is a Mark III Churchill tank, which is based in Sweden. That's one of the military museums there. It's the only surviving example that we know of that arrived in Sweden after the Second World War and was used for various training purposes. Sadly, this example has the turret, but it doesn't have the armaments like the guns and that sort of thing included in it. So it's just more or less a shell. And sadly, they have much information on this, and we are currently working with them to try and find the history of the tank itself. It might be just now that next year, okay, the orders for the Churchill tanks arrived in 1940, the contracts, but no Churchill tanks were completed until 1941. So, which means next year, if I'm correct, is the 80th anniversary of the Churchill tank. My father, if I'm right, does have a model that I built. It's partially built, it's partly constructed. He does have a Churchill tank, which he will show you now, hopefully. well as Churchill tanks, the wagon works constructed 25-pounder heavy explosive shells, copper bands for shells, mines, TNT boxes, bomb lifting cradles, stamping and forgings for aircraft and tanks. And we have been told, but we haven't seen any records or evidence yet, that the aircraft that the Gloucester had involvement with were such aircraft as the Hurricane, which obviously many of you are probably aware that the Gloucester Aircraft Company built during the war. They also built mountings for unrotating projectiles and components for tank carrying road vehicles. Now, it might be interesting to know, my father has a letter, a departmental letter, which I will get him to show you shortly. But I'd like to mention this because it's a bit of history that is often forgotten during the war. Now, hopefully the photograph that comes up shortly will show the artifact, the item that I'm going to be talking about briefly now. And I think it's rather interesting to mention this. I hope you can see the image now. The image, as many of you might be aware, is of the Mulberry Harbour. It was constructed for use on VE Day. Sorry, not VE Day, sorry, D-Day, for the D-Day landings. Now, if I can find the page I'm looking for in one of the books we've got, it might be interesting. It might be interesting for me to read out a section. Here we go. The most dramatic part of the company's work came with two orders, which were placed on February 29th and 1st of March 1944 for Wales. Wales were large steel structures designed to pivot. They looked as though they might be part of bridges, but they were really for no one in the company. But what they were really for, no one in the company had any idea, nor had the contractors for whom the orders were received, although the name suggested that it might be something to do with shipping. What everyone did know, however, was that it was a project of electrifying urgency. The work went on day and night, one shift coming on and another went out to dinner, and uniformed men being drafted from the army to help out. Only when the story of the Mulberry Harbour was released to the public did the men realise that the whales on which they had been working were the vital the long floating keys to rise and fall with the waves. Now that is a rather interesting point to make, because it's no one really knows the history of these, and until I found this book, I didn't know. So those were the pivoting sections for the Mulberry Harbour, and as far as I'm aware, two parts of the Mulberry Harbour survived. One part is still in situ, and that's the concrete pads, the sort of the bridge sat on, and there is one of the steel girder sections preserved. I think it's at one of the military museums, either in London or Bovington or somewhere like that. Now I'll hand it over to my dad, who has a departmental letter that was sent in-house after someone suggested something to do with the war. This artifact is dated 1943. Now, as we go further forward, some of the history isn't recorded as such in any books or any other way other than through knowledge of sort of records, which we have still yet to go through. We've gone through over 116 photographic albums, but there's still more in the local archives that we are going through, and we have had various and numerous meetings with the archives themselves, who have said that we can make the archive more readily available than they can, and they are happy for the museum to work with them to photograph the archives and sort it all out and go through everything. But now we move on to post-war, 1948, and for those who can see behind me, I have a map dating 1948. This is a photocopy of a map that is held at was the Life Museum, or the Folk Museum, which is now taken over by the Civic Trust and is now called the Folk of Gloucester. Now this map is the entire work site, and it might be interesting to note that the only surviving section of this site or building that survives, if you can see, is this red building here. There's a red line going through it because the building is divided into two sections, and the front section nearest Bristol Road, many of you might know as JDR Carting, which is according to this was the paint shop, stores, pipe fitting shop, and various other shops. And we have spoken to the director of JDR Carting, who has sort of allowed us access to the building on more than one occasion, and we've shown people around, and they do have, if you go into the lower half of the site, in where the kids can have a go on various things, they do have, if you look in there, you can see the roof, and it's got curved sections within the roof. That was the paint stores where they store the paint, and it was built with the curves in mind, just in case an explosion happened, the roof would take the heavy blunt of any explosion that would happen. Now we move on to a couple of years later. Now we're moving to the 50s. Now, the first part of the 50s, we had the Festival of Britain, which many of you might know happened in 1951. Now I have a lovely example here of a book that was produced by the company during the Festival of Britain, and I might be interested to I'll show you. Here's an overview of the works, if you can see. Bristol Road in the foreground, and that large building in the middle is the JDR is what is JDR Carting now, which is a lovely book. It's also got here we are talking about the Maharaja coach, the Maharaja of Indoors Carriage State Saloon. Here's a lovely sort of photograph of the carriage and the interiors. That was produced in 1951, sorry, for the Festival of Britain. And now, I did forget to mention earlier, during the 1930s, that as well as obviously a lot of the construction for World War II happened, in sort of the 1934 roughly, the works constructed had an order from the Great Western Railway at Swindon to build the diesel rail car. Now, this is a model of one of the Gloucester built examples, number 8. Unfortunately, none of the Gloucester examples are preserved, unfortunately. There's one Swindon built example, which is more of the square ended. And there's an earlier built example, which is very similar to the Gloucester built one, but not a Gloucester. There is also, there were various contracts that Gloucester had for these, including a prototype buffered example and also the prototype parcels model example. Unfortunately, like we said, none of them are preserved at all. Now we move forward again, sorry for going back, to 1956, when someone who held quite a high involvement in the First and Second World Wars, his name was General Sir William Duchy Morgan. And if all goes well, I do have a photograph of General Sir Duchy Morgan. and hopefully it will come up on the screen now. And General Sir William Duchy Morgan became chairman of the wagon works during the 1950s and 60s. And here's a photograph of him in his uniform. And he also, as well as being obviously taken quite a high role in World War I and World War II, he was also in charge of the Mediterranean Theatre of Operation, which obviously many of you might be aware of. Now we have, or my father has, shall I say, a wagon plate, which is commonly referred to as a D plate because of the shape of it. This example is B424609, lot number 3032, built 1957. Now, from research, we have managed to find a possible example, which is very similar to the Gloucester built one, and that is located on the Dean Forest Railway. It's a ballast wagon. So if I can pass over to my father, who will show you this. I do hope you managed to see that. If not, I'm sure we can sort of work something out and show you again. So next, we sort of move forward, sort of late 50s, early 60s, and we have this lovely example, and again, another catalogue from the company, this time very highly coloured, with green and red with a white G on the front. And if I flip it over again, inverted, so we've got the red with the white G and the small green. This covers the later period of the company's manufacture, and it's more of a very highly coloured, contrasted to the earlier example just in black and white. And then obviously we move to the early 60s again, or not, at least 1960, when the company reached its 100th anniversary, or 100th birthday as it was. And during that period, the company had commissioned a book to be produced, which is this one here. It's the history of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. Unfortunately, this only goes up to about the late 1950s, early 1960s, and I'm currently, with this and other records, writing a new book to complete the history, as the company sort of went defunct or closed down after being taken over in about 1994. And this book has a sort of foreword by the gentleman I mentioned earlier, General Sir William Morgan. So that's a lovely book. That's the one we've got in the museum collection. And this book is what I also read that section out regarding the Mulberry Harbour. Now, this is where the history sort of fades away, as it was during the period. Obviously, I did also forget to mention earlier on that during the British Railways period, so 1948 onwards, the wagon works constructed various sort of carriages, Mark I coaches, DMUs, and I do have two examples in model form of the DMUs that were built by Gloucester during the 50s and 60s. This example here is a Gloucester example of the Class 122 diesel multiple unit, or in this case, it was a rail car. They were commonly nicknamed bubble cars. If I show you the end, that's the tail, the end, the back, and there's the front end. And the next example I'm going to show you, quite a few of the Class 122 survive. There's one locally on the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway. The prototype is currently located on the South Devon Railway. And the next one I'm going to show, I've got two parts to this example of this model. First of all, I'll show you these. These are original British Railways drawings, as it was, but they were quite common. The Gloucester built class 128 parcels unit. These are sort of the more recent examples of the GWR parcels unit. One example here is of the non-gangwayed variety, which is BR drawing 644 and a lot number 30522. And this other one, which sadly before we received it, it was slightly damaged before we received it. This is of the gangwayed variant, which is diagram BR643 and is lot number 30551. And I do have an example of the gangwayed version here. Here we are. This is quite a heavy model. This is the gangwayed version. If I just show you the end, if you can see on the end, you can see a gangway on both ends, that is. These were built so they could carry passenger trains as well during the period, or other sort of other sort of DMUs and that sort of thing. And it might be interesting to know these were nicknamed Scooby-Doos during the period. And now that's sort of it for the railway industry, the sort of railway engineering. Apart from during the 50s and 60s, up until this point, the wagon works patented a Gloucester bogie, as it was, which was commonly used on railway wagons. My father has a small working model, or should I say large-scale working model of the Gloucester bogie, which I'll get him before I write it. Thank you, Dad. Now that's quite a heavy model, I will admit. It's, if I'm right, it's about 3.5 inches in like track wide, and on that model, it's got working axle boxes, working suspension, and it can move as well. So it's a fully working model of the Gloucester bogie. And the last, I should say during this point, the last carriage and wagon rolled out of the works in approximately 63 and 68, roughly. And obviously they continued to manufacture Gloucester bogies during the 60s into 70s. And some of the rolling stock you can still see on the main line today. You can see Gloucester, or examples of Gloucester bogies and Gloucester suspension on the main line today. Some of them obviously we didn't have the chance. The museum didn't have the chance to purchase 2 Gloucester bogies or a wagon that had Gloucester bogies on, which was a sea cow, sort of a ballast hopper wagon. Unfortunately, we weren't able to raise the funds in time. We did have earlier when we first formed the opportunity to buy a Class 100 DMU car, which was one of the first batches of DMUs built by Gloucester. And again, unfortunately, that sort of fell through. We weren't able to raise the funds in time. Now, this is where the history sort of vanishes. Written history sort of vanishes, apart from public, like brochures, leaflets, and that sort of thing that can still be found today. So if we look at 1961, the wagon works itself was taken over by what is now known, or what was known then and probably still is now, Wingates Limited. Wingates took over the wagon works until about 1968. And from 68 to about 77, it was taken over again by Babcock and Wilcox. And during this period as well, so 1962-ish to 1977, so it was split, the site was split in half, sort of thing. It was taken over by Merhill Limited, And obviously, many of you who know of Merhill, they manufacture tractors, diggers, and that sort of thing for the military and general use, of which there are some examples still around today. Then we move forward again to 1977 to 1983, roughly, with Babcock's Merhill. And then 1983 to about 1986, Wibau UK. I apologise if I got that wrong. It's written WIBAU. And then from 1986, it was taken over again by Babcock's Industrial and Electrical Processing, I think it is, or products. And then finally, it was taken over by a Welsh company from 1996 and 1986 to about 1994 by Powell Dufferin Limited. It might be interesting to know. I know I skipped this earlier, but there was a Welsh connection that goes back to the wagon works, right back into sort of the 1890s and 1880s, when the wagon works had 600 depots all over the world, and of which about 6 of them were based in South Wales. So there was a depot, like a wagon repairs facility, in Newport, Cardiff, Kilwine, which is in sort of near Aberdare, Pontypool, which obviously many of you might know is the Pontypool and Blaenavon Railway. They're sort of located near the former the wagon repairs facility that Gloucester had. And obviously there was many more. There was one in London, Birkenhead, Lydney, and many other places. And the Lydney one, many of you who go to Lydney might know the bus depot near Lydney train station. The bus depot is on the site of the former wagon repairs facility. That was owned by the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited. And then sort of this is where between 1996 until quite recently, to be fair, there was no history for wagon works at all, until myself, my father Paul, who you've sort of seen holding the artifacts, my partner, who sadly can't be with us today at the moment because they're quite busy, came to form the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Museum initially. That was 2016, and since then we've travelled mainly in Gloucestershire and acquiring artifacts. As you can see here, we've got many more artifacts, which are mainly on our website at the moment, as we don't have premises at the minute. We started out as a portable mobile museum, taking our exhibition and our displays to various events such as Gloucester Day, Gloucester Goes Retro. We held, as I mentioned earlier, a display at the what was the Life Museum, now the Folk of Gloucester, and we've attended Tewkesbury Steam Rally. We were supposed to be attending the Worley Model Exhibition at the NEC in Birmingham this year, but sadly that was put off due to restrictions and that sort of thing, so we weren't able to go there. In 2017, some of you might not be aware, but as the company went defunct in about 1994, it was decided that the museum would register the company again. So it's registered. Myself and my partner registered the museum, registered the company ourselves. So my partner and myself are both directors of the reborn Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company Limited, which isn't trading in it. It's sort of a company that is not trading until such a time where we can trade. Then we skip to, like I say, we go to many events, and then we skip forward again to this year, when in September this year we managed to finally register as a charity, and that's pretty much where we're finished for today. Sort of thing, we there's plenty more we can talk about, but I think we'll leave it there. Obviously there's a lot more history that we haven't covered, but that can be for another day. Or if you wanted anything, please do get in touch with us, and you're more than welcome to email us, telephone us. You can find our details on our website, which is www.grcwm.jimdofree.com. And I think for now we'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for having us, and we we'll look forward to speaking to any of you at an event we attend or come and see us in the future or whatever, really. So thank you very much for having us, and I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for that, and your dad, Paul. I'm sorry we had a few technical difficulties there with Paul not popping up when he should be. I'm not sure what we could do about that. Please bear in mind that that talk was supposed to be live in the building today. Obviously, we weren't able to do that. We basically cancelled Railway Day at the Folk, but then decided to try and pull these talks together just so that we had a little something to show everybody. Huge thanks to Aaron for very quickly converting that talk into a Zoom talk. He was supposed to have all the artifacts out on display for people to look at and see close up, but obviously he couldn't do that, and we just sort of did the best we could with Zoom. Anyway, our next talk is with Ian, and it's in a few minutes' time, so I'm going to go and get that set up now, and we'll see you in a minute.
Hello everybody, my name is Ian Hatton. I am Gloucester bred and born, and I currently work on the railway. I was born within sight of the wagon works, and believe it or not, I actually started at Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon, went into an engineering role rather than a railway role. So as my role is a guard, I just wave the flag and off we go, and I'll show you some slides. So hopefully it should start up. All see a picture. He says, right. This picture, I travel over most of my working day of Brookthorpe Crossing, which was originally known as Nass Crossing. Nass Crossing was where I started my interest in railways. Father took me and my sister out for a drive in the car. We went up to the gates. We got friendly with the signalman there, and we got to know him inside the box as well. There he is. And that was when the mechanical signalling was still there in 1968. In the meantime, I became interested in the railways, and California Crossing is one example of the signal boxes that was on the Eastgate Loop. That box still exists at Toddington on the Gloucestershire and Warwickshire Railway. And I spent a lot of time in my younger days then watching trains like this at Eastgate. This is a Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon built cross-country unit, and they were quite often seen around here, based in Bristol. And I'm pleased to say that some of the units still survive today. This one is in Shackerstone, and this one I went on a ride only last year on the East Lancashire Railway. Gloucester Carriage and Wagon Company interiors were famous by the curved edges around the glass windows. If you notice the woodwork around the actual glass and the formica of the saloon of the diesel multiple units. And this is what you can see down the end of the train. The bubble cars, as Aaron was talking about earlier. And just to prove it, this is the plate that's fitted underneath the train. Built 2 years before I was born. However, he's still running around and preservation, pleased to say. Now, Gloucester Foundry was also linked to the wagon works. And although this may look like a bit of a boring picture, towards the bottom left where you see that piece of torn off car, you can just about pick a rail. That used to be the rail connection that came round towards the Wagon Repairs Limited off the main line, but also provided a connection round Eastgate Station, so the Midland Railway never incurs on the Great Western Railway. Some of you might remember the subway that went along the long footpath towards the T station, and I believe that that silver cover halfway down the right-hand side of the picture is still the subway, partly covered in, and can be seen by the pipes emerging on the wall on the left-hand side. So I started work as the Wagon Works, engineering, Babcock and Wilcox, Babcock Moxie, Babcock Electrical Projects, and then I concentrated on engineering rather than the railway. I kept my railway as my interest. However, back in 2003, I ended up selling these. I became a guard on the West Trains as it was then, and there is a ticket machine that we issued tickets from. However, being a guard is not just a waving the flag, selling tickets. you have to know, oh, just back to tickets. A rare ticket to be seen, Pilning Station, one of the least used stations in Gloucestershire. I thought I'd better take a photograph of a customer's ticket whilst I still had one. This is the rule book. We have to know the rule book. It's very thick, it gets thicker, and I was told that the railway rule book was being created by blood. When you think of the amount of incidents that have occurred over the railways over the years, improvements are continually being made, even in 2020, and that is the rule book that we have to know. There's just a typical module of the rule book preparation and movement of multiple unit passenger trains. Not only do we have to know the rules, we have to know where we're going. And Network Rail provide us with a thicker document with plenty of pages in, lots of illustrations of various instructions that we have to obey for going round the routes. We also have to know the trains. This was a typical train that we had in Gloucester, as you can probably recognise some of the backgrounds there. £50 penalty fare or prosecution if you fail to produce a validated Oyster card. As you can see, this train came from Silverlink Railways, came to Gloucester on Great Western. We have to know the trains. There have been some improvements over the years, even recently, because how many remember signs like this? Passengers are requested not to use the lavatories while the trains are standing at the stations. And even this train had a modern label equivalence. This toilet flushes directly onto the track. One of the big improvements, of course, with flushing it onto the track is if you have a look at the bottom of this picture, you see some little red objects. And they are actually tomatoes. Look how close they are growing to the rail and they're not being flattened. However, sewage on the track is a thing of the past. Various other improvements have taken place over the years of the railways. Gas lights are no longer allowed. This is actually in the London Transport Museum. It's actually an LED light with a mantle to illustrate a gas light. Things like the automatic warning system that the Great Western Railway developed. This is a modern display image. We're using LEDs in a cab. And another invention that's come in since I've worked on the railway in 2003 is the train protection and warning system. It's effectively a grid system that sends a frequency to the train. If the driver goes past the red signal, it flashes the red light in the cab, and if he goes too fast on an approaching curve, it also flashes the red light in the cab. No getting past that one. You can't go through red traffic lights on the railway. Another improvement since I've been on the railway is the improvement of digital radios. Trains have digital radios fitted where the signalman can speak directly to the driver, and likewise the driver back to the signaller, and they're all uniquely registered, and this means to say we don't have to go on the track side now, we can talk into the GSMR. On the top of the GSMR is another signaling device called a token, which this train was using at the time. Semaphore signals still abound around our network. This is Worcester. This was photographed only a matter of a few months ago during lockdown when I had a bit of time, all peace and quiet, and still operated by levers. Again, this is in the locality of Worcester. More modern signalling, of course, involves coloured lights. These have been in since Eastgate Station closed in 1975, and they're controlled by panels like this. You turn a knob, you press a button, all the white lights set up in between, all the points change, and when the train goes along, the red lights go along with the train, and the signalman can see exactly where the train is. If you're wondering where this is, the top left is Weston-super-Mare and Yatton, and immediately the lines below is Bridgewater Station, where I have been twice this week. However, even the signals are being replaced now with LEDs, and I will say in my engineering capacity that LEDs has probably been the most revolutionary technology that's ever come in, and signals are now being replaced with LEDs and structures like this, also on straightforward lines, and the LEDs can penetrate through the lights, the fog, to a certain degree, and you get little lightweight signals. They don't need great big massive structures nowadays. This one is actually coming in on the approach to Stroud. However, mishaps do occur. We probably remember when the train derailed. This was the last remaining container on London Road Railway Bridge. When things happen, they cause disruption, and it's not just incidents with the train, it's with the structure as well. There you can see an abutment falling away, which imposed an immediate speed restriction of 5 miles an hour. It isn't just the infrastructure that gets flooded. You get tunnels popping out of water. This was the Somerset levels during the night 2014. As you can see, it overwhelmed the railway. We terminated trains at Bridgewater, but also other problems we get on the railway is people come and do this to our trains. This was done, I believe, in the early hours of the morning on a public train on its way to Severn Beach. They commandeered the train, literally sprayed it and attacked it. And this is one of the dangers that we have of graffiti artists on the train. Another problem we get in stations is seagulls and pigeons. So periodically, birds like this come round every Friday and chase them off. Bristol Temple Meads is going to have some money spent on it. The roof is going to be refurbished as part of big enhancement works in Bristol. So hopefully birds like this will have less to do in chasing off the gulls. They are a nuisance. Pigeons in particular cause problems, but also people who take no notice of road signs cause problems. Warning, very low bridge. As an alternative, on the left there, you can see level crossing. This is in Ely, in Cambridgeshire, where tall vehicles like buses have to go over the level crossing. The other problem with places like Ely, nowadays you get electrification, so those wires got 25,000 volts flowing through them. Another problem you get, people trespassing on the railway. But what are all these people doing on the railway? There's men in orange jackets as well. Well, believe it or not, I paid £25 for this special event. It was an event to celebrate Brunel, and Network Rail actually closed the line and enabled a select group of people to actually walk across the Tamar Bridge. It had to be done in the early hours of Sunday morning because the trains had to continue to run. So there we are, legalised trespassing, but I had to pay the costs. It didn't take long to walk over. It's about 10 minutes. It's quite steep, but even so, trespassers on the railway can cause problems. However, being a guard, you do get to visit places that not everybody can visit. It says Exeter St David's on the back of the train there. That is actually in Sheffield. I asked by my boss if I would be interested in taking the train to Sheffield. Yes, I would. So First Great Western, as we were then, chartered the train, and I took it all the way to Sheffield as part of the Association of Community Rail Partnerships. I also have taken a train onto the Dean Forest Railway. This is one of our Class 150s that have taken over from the first generation diesel motor units that we were seeing earlier. And there it is in Park End Station. And of course, we come back onto the main line at Lydney, the original railway line to across the Severn Bridge, passed on the left-hand side of the fence for half a mile or so, then crossed over the main line onto the old Severn Bridge. There we are, back onto the main line, on the way back up to Gloucester. As a guard, I was quite impressed with the train that I took a picture of this apple core. That was the only piece of litter left in the train after everybody got off at Gloucester. I wish our other customers would treat the trains in the same way. However, our passengers do have to have information. This was actually Swindon, the Weymouth train leaving Swindon, which was itself unusual. To go from Swindon, it normally goes from Gloucester or from Worcester. But people need information screens. They have it on their phones, but they also have to learn how to press buttons. You'd be amazed how many people stand outside the train and watch the train and don't press one of these things when it's lit. That's how you can get inside of a train and out of it, of course. Then, of course, we have bikes. Now you see my folding bike on the left-hand side, and you see the bike racks here on the right-hand side. Bicycles are encouraged, but they don't all fit on the trains. So that's why I bought myself a Brompton bike. This year, of course, we've seen COVID-19 affect the railway quite badly, number of passengers, and this was the M5 on a Saturday morning in April. Hardly a vehicle to be seen. We were all in lockdown at the time. And here is the northbound carriageway of the same motorway. So that's a little bit of what I do. I go up to Malvern, I go down to Taunton, across to Cardiff, and include a lovely little line called the Severn Beach line. So that is me as a guard. I'll just stop sharing now and you can see me come back. And hopefully, here we are. That's the end of my little talk as a guard. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ian. That was a brilliant insight into your life as a railway guard. So that's the end. Again, sorry if there were any problems going through, but I think the content was excellent. And I want to say a huge thanks to all of our speakers who, when lockdown was announced, they kind of pulled it out of the bag and managed to turn all of this around really quickly. So we're very appreciative of that. Keep an eye on our Facebook page for any future events. We'll try and do some more of this live streaming and videos as time goes on, as soon as we're allowed to again. Hopefully it'll only be a couple more weeks until we can get back in the building and start recording some more things. And then hopefully soon we'll be able to open up to you all again and host some of these talks live, so you can come along as a real live audience. There's a novel idea. So yeah, thanks again. See you all soon. Take care of yourselves. Cheerio.